The Vietnam War has inspired an unusual pop record due to be released next week. All the indications are that it's going to be a big hit. As Nick Glass reports, the idea began when its producer, Paul Hardcastle, saw a film about Vietnam.
The documentary Vietnam Requiem was made by the American network ABC in 1982. Library footage of the war was intercut with personal reminiscences of 5 men who served in Vietnam and were heavily decorated for heroism. One American critic described the film as a powerful indictment of the soulless horror of war.
In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was 19.
The film was shown on British television earlier this year and inspired a young record producer, Paul Hardcastle, to create a pop song from it.
But it wasn't. It was different in many ways, and so were those who did the fighting. In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was 19. In Vietnam, he was 19.
The record is entitled, not surprisingly, 19. It was largely created at his home at Leytonstone in London. Hardcastle took some words from the documentary and added a disco beat. An electronic drum kit was a good starting point.
The 19 record was done with one of these.
Then add a bit of bass. The words from the documentary were given a little rhythm and distortion on another keyboard.
In Vietnam, he was 19.
What one American war veteran said in the documentary particularly registered in Hardcastle's head.
You're 18 years old and you're wearing somebody's brains around on your shirt because they got their head blown off right next to you.
And after the Hardcastle treatment,
They got their head blown off. They got their head blown off. They got their head blown off right next to you. They got their head blown off right.
the single comes out next week. Dubious taste or not, it seems destined to be a hit.
But was exposed to hostile fire almost every day. 19.
And hit or not, certainly Vietnam very much a talking point.
And straight into the charts after last week's spot on the whistle test, it's U2. They are not the highest new entry though, because slamming in at number 4 is Paul Hardcastle and a thing called 19. Thought it would get there eventually. Now beautifully timed this, because this week is the 10th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Mr Hardcastle, by the way, is one of the UK's top remix producers, working with bands like Third World and Change, and most recently with Ian Dury. The video for 19 will get its first showing on TV in just a few seconds' time. That's after we've checked out the top 3, and surprise, surprise, after 2 months in the top 40, Phyllis Nelson makes it to number 1, and a record there that still hasn't got a deal in a native USA. Right, back to that new entry, the highest new entry, the video now for Paul Hardcastle's 19, which includes some harrowing and authentic Vietnam War footage that you might find disturbing. This is Paul Hardcastle and 19.
In 1965, Vietnam seemed like just another foreign war. But it wasn't. It was different in many ways, and so were those who did the fighting. In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was 19. In Vietnam, he was 19.
Paul Hardcastle's 19, which looks certain to be next week's number 1 single. If you want to recap on the hits, don't forget CFAX, page 264.
But in the meantime...
What's number 2, Janice?
John, move closer.
Just on the outside, dear, if you don't mind. Paul Hardcastle, this is the new number 1, 19.
Yeah.
In 1965, Vietnam seemed like just another foreign war.
Move closer. That's nearly except for one, the big one. He's a producer, he remixes records, and he's number 1.
Yes, for the 2nd week running, Paul Hardcastle, 19.
Britain's best-selling single, it's number 1, a really strong song, a really strong statement as well. Next week, though, we're reading and writing.
And this has been a number 1 for 3 solid weeks.
Paul Hardcastle, sharper than Steve Wright's DJ. This is 19.
None of them received a hero's welcome. Unlike Vietnam, World War II saw America unite behind their fighting men. The two wars were just as different on the front lines as they were back home.
And your guess is as good as mine as to what's going to be number one next week. Paul Hardcastle is still there, fourth week, 19.
Unlike Vietnam, World War II saw America unite behind their fighting men. The two wars were just as different on the front lines as they were back home. 19.
To your left a little bit.
When all we see is the view.
All that means, of course, that Paul Hardcastle is still number one. But what of next week?
Well, next week it's got to be the crowd, I think, but Mike Reed and Dixie Pitch will tell you about it. Meantime, here's this week's number one. Good night from Don and the Pops.
Unlike Vietnam, World War II saw the two wars were just as different on the front lines as they were back home.
19, the single which this very morning made it to number one. Its theme, as you shall see, is the Vietnam War.
In Saigon, a U.S. military spokesman said today more than 700 enemy troops were killed last week in that sensitive border area. Throughout all of South Vietnam, the enemy lost a total of 2,689 soldiers.
The connection between Vietnam and London lies in an East End back street. The hit single was produced here from a basement recording studio at the home of its composer, 26-year-old Londoner Paul Hardcastle. Although he plays keyboard and guitar, his main interest is in technical wizardry. The idea came to him from an American documentary.